Hello, my name is Tony Mansueto. Welcome to Seeking Wisdom and to our series entitled Power and the Common Good. Today we'll be talking about the principal technique that we use for building power, specifically the individual relational meeting. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to learn a little bit more about Seeking Wisdom. You can visit our webpage below, and if you're interested in supporting us, please visit our Patreon page. We look forward to developing a longer term relationship with you. And thank you so much. Now, the purpose of individual relational meetings, as we said, is fundamentally to build power. And we do this by identifying potential leaders, building relationships with them, and helping them to grow and develop. And in order to do that, we also need to map out their interests, find out what they're connected to, what's important to them, what makes them tick, map out their networks, find out who they listen to, who listens to them, who they can get to do stuff, who can get them to do stuff, and then assess the level and complexity of their current capacity to exercise leadership. Now, before you get started, it's important to know yourself and to know yourself in something like the way that you will be getting to know people by doing individual relational meetings. And the best way to do this is to do an individual relational meeting with yourself or to have an experienced organizer do one with you and share the results. And you'll be looking here for three principal things. First, what are your interests? What are you trying to accomplish? Why do you want to build power? Um, what are you invested in? What are you connected to? Second, what are your networks? Who are you connected with? Who do you pursue these aims with? Who do you listen to? Who listens to you? Who can you get to do stuff? Who can get you to do something that you might not otherwise do? And then finally, what are your capacities? What's the breadth of your vision? What is the scope of your temporal perspective? Are you a big picture, long term thinker, or are you mostly invested in accomplishing things that can happen in the short term, whatever that means to you? And it's very important to be aware of these things because you're likely to be engaging people who are actually pretty different from you. And that's, in a certain sense, that's the whole point. So you need to know where you are uh, because that will help give you some perspective on others and not make assumptions that are unwarranted and not jump to false conclusions in your interpretations. As you're beginning to learn these skills, it's also important to give some careful thought to who you are going to engage through an individual relational meeting. Um, you are just beginning to develop skills, so you want to choose a subject, not necessarily who's going to be easy, because sometimes you can learn the most from very difficult subjects, but someone who is going to have something to say, someone who's actually going to be willing and able to engage you, and someone who is going to be interesting, so that even if it becomes difficult, you'll have a sense of what the missed opportunities were in the conversation. So, in general, I would suggest that you begin with someone someone that you know you can connect with, but make sure you don't know them too well. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to approach them with a beginner's mind. And it may actually be rather awkward asking them some of the agitational questions that you probably should have asked them a long time ago, but haven't. Failing that, or if for some reason you can't think of someone who falls into that category that you actually want to engage in this way, begin with someone in your principal arena of interest, the arena in which you're trying to accomplish something, who is in a publicly identifiable leadership role, but not someone who is prominent, inaccessible, or a face leader, not someone who is going to be focused primarily on what sort of public impression they're making. Um, and in general, the older the person, the more likely you are to have a fruitful meeting. Subjects under 30 years old often have a great deal of difficulty um, uh, answering these questions because, in a certain sense, there isn't enough of a track record, there isn't the accumulated self-awareness for them to be able to answer these questions well. Before you start, you will also want to get as much background information as possible. Um, you will want to ask the person who introduced you, if you were introduced by somebody else, to give you a sense of that person. So what's your sense of them? What are they about? What are they trying to accomplish? Who do they listen to? You want to do a basic internet search. You want to get a sense of their um, sort of their electronic footprint in cyberspace, things they've published, news stories, things like that. You're not doing, a public record search or a background investigation or, anything that is focused primarily on their private lives. What you want to get a sense of, again, is what they're interested in, what they've invested in publicly. And finally, you want to be uh, very intentional as you engage the person on observing their office. That's generally speaking the best place to do one of these individual relational meetings for the simple reason that people's offices make a statement, not a private statement, not an intimate statement, but gives you a sense of how they want to present themselves publicly. Um, or occasionally you will have people who want to meet in their home, in which case, you may get something a little bit closer in, but still basically public out of their living room, the room where they ordinarily receive guests. If you meet someone in neutral ground, for example, at a restaurant or a coffee house or something, obviously you're not going to get that. And you do need to be careful about noise and attention and focus and stuff like that. But you can still get a sense of them by how they're presenting themselves. How did they choose to dress? What was the level of formality? What are the color choices? What are they saying by the way they present themselves? So all of this is important. All of this is information that's going to help you assess who the person is and what they're trying to accomplish. Now we come to the conversation itself. And what I'm going to do here is to point you to a sample text and ask that you pause the video and visit that text. It's the first book of Plato's Republic. And then we'll gradually unpack that, going through the various stages of what turns out to be a very remarkable individual relational meeting that Socrates conducts in this dialogue. And that will draw out the principal characteristics of an individual relational meeting. So I provided here an online link where you can go to read the first book of the Republic. Obviously, if you prefer to read it elsewhere in a hard copy, that's fine too. And then when you're finished, you can simply resume the video and go on to the next slide. And so the first critical feature that we see in the way in which Socrates handles the interactions in this selection from the Republic is that he is perpetually asking questions, and specifically agitational questions. You think of the agitator vanes in one of the old-fashioned washing machines, which stirs things up and gets the dirt out. You're not necessarily looking for dirt, but you're looking for something that is substantial and meaningful. And so when we see Socrates enter the home of his principal interlocutor, Cephalus or Cephalus, um, he basically turns around to the guy and says, "Hey, you're on death's doorstep. What's it like?" Okay? And that might not seem terribly polite, and actually, contrary to his nature, Socrates is a shade softer than that in the way he frames the question. But he gets an awful lot out of that. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute about what he gets. But he gets an awful lot out of that. Now, you may not want to be quite that agitational, but there are a number of questions that you can ask that will push people to go beyond, shall we say, their elevator speech and tell you something about who they actually are. Again, not intimate details, not something that pertains to their private life, but who they are as human beings, what they're trying to accomplish. And actually, um, one of the most straightforward ways to do that is to say, what are you trying to accomplish? And often they will say, accomplish where? You mean here? If it's, say, a work setting or a political setting or what? And just say, well, in general, what are you trying to accomplish? Um, another question, it's a little bit more subtle, is to ask people why they do what they do. Why do you do what you do? Right? And that will indirectly actually push them to tell you what they think they're doing, to tell you what they are trying to accomplish. Um, but there are a lot of other agitational questions. Um, Simply asking people what brought them to the neighborhood, the city, the country, to the organization, to working in a field, is asking them to provide an account of a significant life decision. And that will give you something that's very, very, very much off to the soft end of the spectrum. You can raise questions that build off something you noticed in their office. Something about again, don't zero in on the private, but if there's something that indicates a certain accomplishment, or perhaps a book that seems interesting, you ask them, what did you think of this book? Um, Another strategy, because particularly with questions that are at the softer end of the spectrum, people will give you, kind of discussion stopping, non-committal answers. They'll say something like, "Well, I thought it was interesting." Ask them, "Well, what was so interesting about it?" Okay? That's a good one to use in any setting. You go to a movie with somebody and you come out, and maybe you don't know the person that well, and you are neither one of you wants to freak the other person out, and so one person asks the other, "What did you think of the movie?" And they say, non-committally, "It was interesting." Well, what the hell was so interesting about it? Tell me. Let's have a real conversation. So that's the aim here. Now, if we look at what Socrates actually gets from Cephalus, it's fundamentally a story. And, to some extent, it's kind of an elevator story. He is, he tells Socrates that he hangs out with the other old guys, and most of them always complain about this and that and the other thing. But he thinks that they're wrong. He thinks that old age is not so bad if you are a good person. Okay? So you get kind of his base level formal public self presentation. And from there, you need to do two things. First of all, you need to actually be interested. And if you're not interested, you may as well leave. Okay? Um, and I'm quite serious about that. I mean, you don't want to be unnecessarily impolite to people, but um, you are looking for people who are interesting. And to be good at this, it is absolutely essential that you are capable of being interested in a lot of different types of people who bring a lot of different things to the table. Um, but you also want to probe more, and of course, that's what that's what Socrates does. He turns around with another much more agitational question. He says, "Well, a lot of people, Cephalus, would say that your old age is fine because you're wealthy." Um, and um, he is pushing him to think more deeply about a situation, to be more honest, to be more thoughtful, more self-aware. Um, and those are the kinds of questions that you want to ask as you unpack a person's story. Ask them, why did you do that? What were you trying to accomplish? Who helped you? Because you want to get the networks. Okay, you know. Socrates could have said, "Well, are there any of the other old geezers out there who give you a different story, who aren't complaining all the time? Is there anyone who shares your perspective? What did you learn from it?" Okay? Those are all the kinds of questions that you want to ask. And you want to help the person reframe their experience in a way that creates the basis for a relationship. Again, it's very important that these questions be contextual and appropriate to the conversation you're having. And um, it's always a delicate balance because you do want to push the person beyond beyond the point of their ordinary comfort zone. Um, but at the same time, you need to try to read their signals and get a sense of whether or not they're going to be responsive and what they'll be responsive to. And that itself is important information because the kind of challenge, the kind of prodding, the kind of poking, even that they will respond to well and happily and in an engaged and meaningful way gives you some sense of what they're actually likely to be able to do. And if they are, simply outraged or don't get it or find that your questions don't make any sense to them, well, those are probably areas where they're not going to go anyway. As you begin to go deeper, you can also begin to help the person reinterpret their experience. And of course, this is what Socrates has already done with Cephalus in suggesting that his old age is relatively comfortable because he's wealthy. Um, but he also pushes further. And when Cephalus tells him that he's okay facing death because he's lived a just life, and he says, "Well, what do you mean by justice? What's justice?" And he says, "Well, it's basically paying your debts." Um, Socrates points out the contradictions of that. What if you owe somebody a weapon and they're insane? Is it just to give them the weapon so they can hurt themselves or someone else? Well, obviously not. So what is justice? And now at that point, Cephalus gets up and leaves, which suggests that Socrates was only going to get so far with him, and the discussion is taken up by the group of young men who then carry the rest of the dialogue along with Socrates. Um, but that is the way in which you create the basis for an ongoing relationship, or discover that there isn't one. Um, in some cases, you'll want to save this for later meetings. You want to make sure that you're hearing the person and you're understanding them before you go too far along the path to reinterpreting and pushing and prodding them towards action. Um, but you can ask them questions like, well, have you ever thought of it in such and such a way? Would you be interested in meeting other people with similar interests or similar challenges? Um, what would you do if someone asked you to do X or Y or Z? Or if they're already moving towards action, and in some cases you'll find people are, what do you plan to do? Why? What kind of reaction are you looking for? What would help? Who are you relying on? And again, that's going to give you a sense of their interests, but also of their networks. And it's very, very, very important to make sure that you're not just getting kind of an abstract account of what they're interested in or of what they believe. You want to get a sense of what they're actually doing. Generally speaking, an individual relational meeting, especially a first meeting, should not last more than about half an hour. There are other types of conversations um, that are in many ways very similar, like an in-depth interview, um, where your target length may in fact be much longer, where you're really sitting down trying to get a sense of the whole shape of someone's life, and you're not necessarily planning to come back, and you're not necessarily trying to move them towards action. But in an individual relational meeting, if the person's interesting, you are going to come back, and you're going to have time to push further. So as you're concluding, you want to make sure of a couple of things. Again, you do want to make sure that you have a sense of what they've actually acted on, because that's what's going to tell you what's really important to them. You want to ask them who else they should be talking to. And that is often a way of beginning to draw a meeting to closure while still giving them some opportunity to elaborate further if there are a few other things that they've really gotten energized about. And that will give you, again, a sense of their networks and what of their networks they're willing to share. Very often, the best people won't share their networks right away, and that may take some more time. Um, Really, really, really important to end the meeting before it's over. You don't want the conversation to peter out. You don't want the person to get antsy or feel awkward because it seems like there might not be anything else to talk about. Um, at a certain point, then after you've asked, who else you should be talking to, you've seen if they have anything else significant to bring to the table. Thank you so much for your time. Okay, and then you actually literally get up and leave. And sometimes they will call you back with more interesting stuff, but you do want to be pretty strict about certainly not taking more time than you told them you were going to. And then after the meeting's over, and preferably fairly soon after the meeting's over, you want to sit down and you want to do an analysis. And this is best if it is actually written up. Um, how long it is really depends on how interesting and complex the person was. But, 1 to 2 single space pages would be probably enough for a pretty thorough analysis of a halfway decent meeting. And you want to identify the subject because you want to have a record of who it was that you talked to. Again, you're going to be sensitive to the person's wishes, so you're not going to publish something like this without their consent. But simply for your own records, you want to identify the subject by name. You want to describe the setting and the dynamics of the meeting. You will want to summarize their story, what they're interested in, map out their networks, and then you'll want to assess the level of leadership that they're exercising and their leadership potential. And we'll introduce these concepts in the next video where we distinguish between people who are passive, meaning they're not really going to do anything, followers who will act on other person's initiative, tertiary leaders who are kind of problem solvers who have a following of people who will help them solve concrete, immediate problems, which may be very simple or may be incredibly complex. Secondary leaders who are beginning to learn how to leverage problems to build power, learning how to turn problems into issues. and how to develop complex sequences of actions that aren't just oriented towards solving problems, but which are actually building power in the long run. And then finally, primary leaders who are focused on principles and values. They're builders of institutions and who have a very uh, long, long durée, as we say, a long range timeline. And then some notes about what kind of future collaboration you think is possible with that individual. So go forth and do individual relational meetings, and feel free to let me know if you want to share some of the results, if you want some help with the analysis and interpretation, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to learn a little bit more about Seeking Wisdom. You can visit our webpage below, and if you're interested in supporting us, please visit our Patreon page. We look forward to developing a longer term relationship with you. And thank you so much.